Hello adventurers, my name is Dan DePietro, and today on the Dice20 Collective, we're going to be talking about engaging your players' backstories. What do you look for in a backstory? When a player hands you a sheet, is there something that you require them to have? Are you looking for NPCs, big bad guys? Are you looking to connect them? All these types of questions and more from 4 DMs who've been through it. Let's dive into the action, but before we do, hit that subscribe button so you'll be notified for the next episode of the Dice20 Collective. All right, so here we are. We have Jim up top, we have John on the top right, and John Vespa on the bottom right. And so let's get into it. So when you start a campaign, maybe it's a module, maybe it's a homebrew adventure or something of that nature, what is it that you guys look for? What do you give a first scrub, the person's excited to tell you their character. What are you looking for in that first 5 minutes of what is this character?
I think I don't know about the rest of you. I know, Dan, you sometimes make a habit of this as well, but I provide a questionnaire for them with regard to backstory that gives a skeleton of how to create one without even realizing you're doing it. You just answer the questions, and then, by the end of answering them, you have a backstory. And I think that's a really good way because, one, it focuses your players on presenting you things you can use in the game. So for instance, one of the questions is about relationships in the backstory of this character. So then you can take what those relationships are and make content out of it, right? So I like that. I also think it just creates a good cohesiveness between everyone's backstories. So I can flip them all up and they're all in that format. It makes it kind of easy to see where things may fit together between characters' backstories as well.
So you're looking for characters and connections right out of the gate.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, and I would say I'm doing the same. And in fact, for my current campaign, I have a Google Doc where I have everyone laid out. And then I have kind of columns for each of the sections of that 10-minute backstory that John referenced. So it's like I have everyone's, what was the defining event in their life? What was who are their main connections? And then I printed it and I kind of just sat with it and then started writing notes because connections jump out.
Yep.
Where, oh, this person's backstory, that's interesting. This could really fit in with this here. And kind of let their backstories start to tell a story a bit.
Absolutely. That's awesome.
A post from John and Dan and most of you guys like a form. I just message everybody individually who's going to be in my game, and I say, hey, what do you want to do? What are you thinking? What are your character's goals? Go over some things roughly. I have a document. I'll keep the notes and everything that we discuss, and I like the one-on-one kind of aspect of it and kind of almost fleshing it out with them. It's a little bit different because the campaigns, we all know each other, I guess, so it's kind of easy to do that.
Yeah.
The other thing that you mentioned when you first asked the question, Dan, is hey, if we're doing a one-shot, if we're doing a campaign, whatever. But I will say that I only put this level of effort into things that I'm running campaigns for.
Right. Yeah. I don't think it's. No one really cares for a one-shot. Although I find it hard to role play for a one-shot because I'm I don't know my character yet.
And typically with one-shots, though, I'm playing with groups that I've played with for a while and just schedules or whatever, people want to run one. And if you're playing with more experienced players, while they might not have a full backstory, I noticed that experienced players in one-shots have really strong quirks or personality characteristics which will help the RP along. And I think it's also that people who have DM'd before tend to feed you great, even in a one-shot, tend to feed you great RP fodder and characteristics or backstory.
I guess the one thing I've noticed in one-shots for a lack of character story is it allows a player to be sort of random and quirky, which can really derail a one-shot. But it makes it for an interesting session to not have a backstory, but to develop one as you're going through that session.
I feel
but I certainly don't require for one-shots.
Yeah, I'm with Jim there. You can bring a lot of you can bring a lot of character without a lot of backstory to a one shot, right? You know?
Yeah.
But the other thing in a campaign, like the contrary to that, in a campaign that's going to go on for, I mean, at least in real time, at least a year. I've never been in a campaign less than that. I'm also looking for in that first read through what's missing. Like there's some
What
that
do you
are
mean what's missing?
well, some character backstories hit all those things and are so fleshed out, and you just have a million of ideas right off the bat, and you kind of have to narrow. Where others that kind of maybe it's the player's first time, or they didn't really know, or didn't have time to answer it, or whatever. And it is just like, man, I just don't have a lot to go with. I tend to go back to that player and ask specifics like, tell me more about XYZ. Or, okay, great, you're totally orphaned and you have no connections whatsoever. Yeah, how'd you get there? Like, help
Right.
me here.
Yeah, and we'll certainly get into the orphan. I think for me, I like to look. The first thing I look at is how does this character fit into my campaign, my homebrew world? Because I think that's really tough. Because if they don't fit into your world, you got to make it fit somehow, some way. And I think you can kind of develop the connection points second. But for me, like in one of the previous campaigns, I had no expectation of like having a furbolg. So I was like, okay, well, I have no clue where they fit, but they're sort of woodland, so I can fit them here, right? So that's my first thing is like, it's not about who they know, because I can kind of make that work, but do they fit into my realm at all? Because if they don't, and you know, they're like whimsical dwarves, well, do whimsical dwarves live in your campaign, right? Like to me, that's the first thing where it's like, does that exist or not, right? Because that's kind of a problem. You want them to play the character they want, but it's like, does that fit into your world? Because if dwarves are stout, angry, and you know, it just doesn't work.
But you know what's interesting there is I think it also comes down to DM style, because you're talking about do they fit in my world? And when you did your most recent campaign, Dan, you had a well-developed world with like factions and parts of the world. When I started my most recent campaign, I was like, hey, some major events happened. Give me your backstories.
That's a good point. You develop the world around the characters, and I certainly put the characters in the world
because
that I had developed. That's true.
Yeah.
I was definitely working from two different angles for sure.
And both can be effective, but my angle tends to be like, all right, I've got a big concept. Tell me your character, and then it's our story. And certainly I'm not saying your campaign doesn't do this, but it does it in a different way. But the characters' backstory are shaping the direction of my campaign and who major players are. And for example, some of my antagonists, I had never thought of until they showed up in players' backstories. And then I'm like, oh, great, you're one of the big bads, you know?
Yeah, that's funny. Yeah, so I make sure they fit thematically within my realm. And then I go to the second cog where I kind of look at it like a key. When you go and you put the key and you've got 5 points for 5 characters, and it's like, okay, well, 3 of these fit for a big bad, but then you got a couple more where it's like, well, that one's just a random one. Like that's just going to be not a side quest, but a side mission. And then the other one's also random. Like they don't fit in. So that's how I sort of look at it to sort of fit those in. And then I go in and add the players, like those, who are the contacts.
So if someone had
if
someone had a character and then they didn't quite fit into what you have, like the Furbolg, let's say, you made that work, right?
Well, I mean, you would have to sort that out in game, right? So
would you ever tell someone no, like for your world, be like, no, that doesn't work?
Get out of here.
I'm just wondering.
So
how rigid would you be? Because the reason I asked is because doing the Dragonlance campaign, it's very select on races, right? So someone wants to play a Draconian.
Hey, maybe this is why you need good session.
No, yeah, okay.
Maybe this is why you need a good session 0. See that Dungeons by Dan episode a few back.
Well, no, I mean that is a good point though. That's why the session 0 exists, because when you had said you were starting a Dragonlance campaign, and I was like, gosh, why are all? I looked at some of the people that you could be, and it's like, well, they're all fighters, like, and I didn't know that was a big thing back then for Dragonlance because I just played it.
Yeah, they're just that Heroes of Lance campaign DL1 through DL16 is just very rigid in what you start with, and that's just how it is.
See, to me, if you said you can't be sorcerers don't exist and there's only wizards, I would be okay with that. Like, it's a limitation, which makes it interesting, and then you start to really focus in on what does a magic user mean, especially if it's only a wizard. And I think that's actually really cool. So if you said no sorcerers,
well, I'm going to try to. I'm going to try to let this person play a draconian in that instance. So we'll see. I just want to see what your input would be. So sorry,
yeah. I mean, I would say I would be. I mean, listen, you're not wrong to say yes, but I would be okay with saying no. Get the fuck out of my game. Like, you can't do that. Like, this is Dragonlance. They're bad guys. Unless you're running an evil campaign, you can't be a draconian.
It can, as Jim sort of alluded to earlier, though, it can also be very informative to you as a DM, or it can be a mystery, and that's okay. So, like, for instance, in a campaign I'm running right now, we just introduced a new player, and he's playing a fire genasi, and I didn't have anything like that in any of what I built for this world.
Yeah, I was thinking about tonight, and I was thinking, like, I don't know how to fit in genasi. Like, they're a weird race to me. And I don't know how I'd fit it into any of my campaigns ever, unless it was a one-shot.
But see, that's the thing. Now you have this, it isn't in the world as constructed, but now there's a player with one. So what's the world do in reaction to that? They've never seen this before. How's that going to go? What are the other players? How are they going to treat this? And they haven't seen it before. So it can create a point of interest that doesn't even necessarily inform story, but will, by its nature, make it.
But you know what you're alluding to there, John, and it's hard to remember this as a dungeon master because everything just kind of becomes normalized if you don't have it front of mind all the time. But you're talking about that player choices should have consequences, and by consequence, I mean cause and effect, not good or bad.
Right.
So if someone's going to play a fire genasi, which, and I know the character you're referring to, fun character, great personality, but there's going to be consequences of that, which is like, if you go to a human village or town, they're not going to greet this creature with open arms. So I think that's actually something that we maybe overlook because we think of it as a race choice, but it's really part of that character's background.
Absolutely.
And their background is shaping their interaction with the world in that way.
Right.
I would just like shoehorn them in like they came from the plane of elemental whatever. That's where they came from. Boom, it's done.
I love you're from the school of I don't care, just play. Just sit at the table. I don't care.
Figure it out.
From the hot ones.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, it's easy to me, like, if someone wanted to play a fire genasi and I don't have some sort of lore based on that, it's sort of difficult for me to, like, fit that in. I'm sure I would fit it in somehow, but it seems complicated, and I have to say I'm a little resistant to it. I don't know what that says about my DMing, but I'm a little resistant to some of those newer races that, I mean, I'm more open to Tabaxi than I am some other race like Fire Genasi or something.
Well, I mean, that's the beauty of it, right? It's your world, so.
Right.
That's interesting to hear, Jim. I didn't realize that we have both been doing that same thing with our campaigns, per se. Because I haven't talked to you a lot about what's informing how you put that together. But yeah, I'm doing something really similar where I keep track of all those backstories.
Yeah.
And then it's really helpful too when, like recently in a campaign I'm running, I had to catch my players up with some info. And a good way to do it is to go, okay, well, who did they used to know? You know, who can show up and provide info and be a trustworthy source because of a background, or maybe not. Maybe I don't always know exactly how the character is thinking of that person in their backstory either. So maybe they're like, I'm never trusting that person again, and it all backfires, and we get something very different that happens and is interesting. But I do think it's really useful to have that stuff to help solve problems you may be having in your campaign or issues you need to take on. Yeah,
they're like a utility knife almost, to be like, how do I push this plot point forward? You grab that person that you didn't really address in the beginning.
You know, it is, but I also think that sometimes I see missed opportunities with that. And with that, what I mean by that is that the concept of player agency is that anytime, like the best part of D&D, why it's better than like a board game or different than a board game, is a board game is very set, right? Like you roll a dice, you have certain moves. But D&D is a game of agency where players are empowered to have choice, and those choices drive the outcomes. And that's why I love D&D. So when I have characters reemerge, I try and put from the backstory, I try and put players in a position where they have to make a choice with that information.
Oh, for sure.
Right. So it's not just like, hey, this friend of yours who is beloved shows up and you feel safe taking this path now. Like this friend from your past shows up and they're in a really bad situation and they need your help, but that help goes against everything you stand for. So you need to make a choice, or it really derails your main mission, things like that, where it puts them in a spot where it's not just all roses and sunshine. It's like, oh, things got more complicated because your backstory reemerged.
Right.
Absolutely. That's cool. Yeah.
I agree with using them to drive a new storyline as a splitting point to say, hey, the roads change direction here if you're going to take that route.
Yep.
And I think in my current campaign, an example is we have a long lost friend of one of the PCs who's being carted off to prison, and that's how the backstory and that character collided. So that character has a decision of go about your important mission that you were on, or divert everything you're doing and go deal with this.
Right. And that's a good way. I think that's a great way to like pull a potentially minor character in from a backstory in to make them more important again, because there's a pretty high, a tense scene to deal with. Do you guys, like, you got 5 or 6 players or whatever, and do you try and combine their bad guys, or do you kind of let them stay separate? I notice I try and combine them if I can, if it makes sense. If it doesn't, then, that's a separate thing.
I certainly try and combine players' backstories. And I'm Dan and Jim, you know that probably better than any 2 people I've played with. It's
sort of like the seven ways from Kevin Bacon, and that's your big bad bad guy. Like, how can we all fit him toward that guy?
Well, not necessarily the big bad guy even per se, but just an overlap in players' backstories that, as Jim was saying, when you sit down and kind of look at it all together, it kind of strikes you. Is great, and especially if it's one of those things, and I think I talked about this in your last video, but especially if it's one of those things that is surprising to my players, that players go, what? That's always a goal for me. I love to get that out of the people at the table. That I didn't see that coming thing is awesome and creates investment on your player's part too, I think.
On the character side, I really enjoy overlapping my characters' backgrounds with other players at the table.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah.
I think it just makes it easier to get into.
I know that I usually work with at least one other person. Usually, I'll say, "Hey, what are you playing?" But it's more like, okay, can we have cross paths at some point just to make this easier? That way, we don't have to start in a bar.
Yeah, John and I have done it multiple characters.
I think that having things merge is good, but I also think it's important, and you guys kind of mentioned this, where it's like, if it makes sense, right? Like, the worst thing I think you can do is force backstories to merge.
Right.
And I think eventually they all kind of can come together in like themes and stories, but I also think it's like, you don't have to rush that. So, and you want players to feel like their backstory matters and alive in the world, but there's certain things that, like, hey, their backstory starts over here, this one's over here. Your campaign's going to go on a long time, and eventually these things can come together. But I think if you force it too early, it just feels a bit artificial. And so I find that I spend a lot of time thinking about how to pace character reveals and backstory into the campaign to keep everyone engaged, but not go so fast that I'm forcing things or I've used up everything I've got by session 8.
Right, yeah, you can have a blistering plot reveal session, and then there goes all the backstory. So how quickly do you reveal each piece? But I'm also a big fan of, just like you said, putting something on the back burner. If something is that oddball out, don't rush it. And I notice, I mean, I play bi-weekly for my session, and within those 2 weeks and within a few months, things start to emerge where you're like, oh yeah, I can fit this in now, but 3 months ago I could not see how this could ever fit in together.
Yeah.
But now I do. I'm a huge fan of that. It will come to you. You don't have to force it.
Yeah.
No, agreed. Yeah, I think I agree absolutely with what Jim said as far as like picking and choosing your spots and making sure it makes sense.
And, you know, one thing related to that is I find it's very different with the number of, by the way, I never notice how much I talk with my hands until I'm on video with them.
You're like, I don't know what to do with my hands.
Anyway, so as a human person, I think that the number of players also dictates some of that. So, like, if you're a beginner DM, I feel like 3 to 4 players is the sweet spot.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think right now in some of our campaigns we have like 6 or 7. And I find it, like, I constantly am thinking, okay, how do I weave everyone's backstory? I'm trying to move this forward with these guys. I don't want this person to feel totally left out.
Yeah, but you have to leave people out for a time, right?
Right. And I try and
that's the nature of the beast, right?
Yeah, and I try and just send like out of game messages like, hey, I remember that your character is like a real thing and we'll get to it. You know, right now we're on this arc.
Yeah, I am constantly worried about that too, that you know, I've been really focusing on this character because this part of their backstory informed where we're at now, what we're doing now, and so they're obviously pretty central to it.
You know,
while at the same time,
I try and deal with that in a different way, where like if you're saying if there's a central theme, I'll jot down a note or two on someone I know I'm not going to get to, like I'm not getting to your character this session, and I know it's all about the other character, and I'll try and like send you some sort of note. That way it keeps your storyline in the back of your mind. Like there's things happening, right? Like just something, just like a note that you pass. That's just like, hey, just so you know.
But I think that's too where if there's themes that are connected, players keep interest. So for example, if like antagonist A is important to this player's backstory, but maybe as you reveal things about antagonist A, there's things that like, you know, that relate, I guess. Like there's themes that relate to maybe this other character that maybe aren't so direct, like, oh, this you guys all you came together and it's all the same big bad that impacted you, but maybe this person was from the same city that this person was from.
Right.
You know, but some sort of connection to start kind of weaving these things together. And like I said, take your time to get there and build towards the end of your game.
Yeah, and that's what I mean, Jim. Like, you know, maybe that's like, okay, you're in the city, right? And so you just throw out that little note that says, hey, so this relates to you because of this, just so you know. You know?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I will write down specific notes. Now, you guys don't see it because we're on Roll20 and I message you guys various things, so you'll never see it, right? But I do write down a note. And I think that's good because it does keep them interested and keep the ball rolling forward for them.
And I think sometimes you'll see that the players actually help you out in that they start to align in some way that you hadn't anticipated, or you thought, you know, maybe you were planning on it, and they start to do it and you're like, oh, beautiful, perfect.
Yeah, that's the best. Like when one player, you know, has a direct connection and another player was like, hey, I just want you all to know, like in RP, like I also was from this sector, like and you're like, oh, I am on cruise control as a DM right now.
I think that happens actually if you're not forcing it. You'll see them try and relate it to themselves somehow, and then you'll seem like a genius, and after you'll, you know, shut your camera off and be like, shit, I had no idea what I stumbled upon. Like, this is way better than I could have ever planned. Let me write this new arc down. And that's exactly what you're saying. Like, you didn't plan it, and then you just let that kind of work itself out.
There's been a couple things in my main campaign that have been exactly like that, where I'm just like, I had this idea, and then someone else mentioned something else just like almost randomly, like a 10-second comment that, you know, doesn't even have much to do with what we're doing right then, but hits me as like, oh, I can take that idea and run with it over here, and in 3 sessions this is going to be nuts. Yeah. Thank you for coming up with that. It's so much better than what I came up with, you know.
But you know, the common theme there is that you're letting the player's backstory and their actions shape how they interact with each other. Yep. And I totally agree, because like in my current campaign, as you all know, there was lots of really good backstories, and it's just coming together in a way that I never would have thought of, that the players didn't have like a huge context in the world, but people want to mesh together. Like there's a natural, you know, we're one party.
Yeah.
Party.
I mean, you're right. It's a group game, right?
Yeah.
Well, there's exactly. You read all the time, you know, stuff online, or I have that says, you know, don't metagame D&D. Don't sit and think about what's the min-max best for this or that. And I agree, but, you know, that's a good thing to keep wary of, player knowledge versus character knowledge and all that. But there has to be this much of it. And I think the way that's expressed is there has to be a want to be in this group together and adventure. You have to get there somehow, right? And everyone kind of knows that. It's ingrained in the fact that you showed up to the table to play at all. But it's really, you know, so I always am kind of anti the no metagaming thing, because we all do it. It just is, it's the innate part of playing the game. You have to me.
Yeah, the other option is starting in a bar, right? You all meet in a bar, right? Like
no metagaming.
Yeah.
I do it too. I know.
Games. None of us ever.
Hey, is it metagaming if you haven't started the game? Now, so a lot of people have the classic, I'm an orphan, or you know, the other variant, amnesia.
My village was burned down, and I'm the only survivor.
Yeah, I'm the only survivor. You know, I mean, how do you guys approach that? If you haven't, how would you? Right.
So I think it actually opens up opportunities, and in some ways it seems limiting. But let's say I'm the only survivor of my entire village. Perfect. Tell me about the people before. Because I can tell you already, some of them also survived and are out.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah. Who do you know that's close to you that you think is dead that I know survived, right?
And the other angle is obviously, well, who did this to you?
Yeah, create.
An antagonist. Yeah.
There's also the link to the link angle. So like, you know, let's just as by way of example. I'm a wizard, and I went to whatever other wizard is my mentor, and yeah, he's dead, and I don't have anyone connected to me anymore. But I bet you he taught someone else.
Right.
I bet you they're out there. Like the link to the link is another way to deal with that, I think.
Yeah, you create a little bubble chart on who you know. That's 7 degrees from Kevin Bacon, the Warlock, right?
The other part of that is that, oh, you had these people you cared about so deeply, and they're gone, and blah, blah, no. And the thing is, like, once people flesh them out, you know, maybe there are so many possibilities, but maybe, you know, this person really shaped your worldview, and, you know, they perished in this terrible thing. Okay. Well, maybe years later you find out secrets about that person you were so close with. And in that way, you have a character from your backstory impacting you now that, without them actually being in physical form and interacting. And maybe they weren't what you thought. Maybe they made a sacrifice you didn't understand. And in that way, I think there's opportunities to push out that backstory. But I try and go back to the player and say, like, well, help me build this out more. Give me a few people and try and put it on them a bit, rather than like, hey, just so you know, you had a really good friend named Bob, and
Yeah.
that's what it's about.
A lot of times I think the amnesia or my village died is just a player being lazy on backstory. To put it bluntly, they're being a little bit lazy a lot of times. Like, I don't really want to come up with something, but I think it's an easy thing to put back on them, just like you're saying, like, well, who killed your guys?
Didn't I do that
Who taught you?
backstory for John's campaign? You know what? Never mind.
But you're right. There's a way to solve that, which is you just have to start asking questions.
Yeah, you ask questions.
Start put them on the spot.
Exactly. Yeah. Yep.
There's also the thing that Jim, your comment makes me think of is the Da Vinci Code. You know, guy dies at the, not to spoiler this for anyone, but guy dies at the very beginning of the story. But really, the whole story is about stuff he's done his whole life. It drives everything in the narrative.
Oh my god, I haven't seen it.
And then,
You are going
that didn't ruin it for you. Trust me, it's fine.
and things that didn't make sense to one of the main characters, his granddaughter, make sense as you unravel that story. That you're right. You can play that exactly the same way in a D&D game. And it's a very effective tool, I think.
And actually, the other thing to do is ask a player, well, you suffered all of this, so how is that going to shape you in game? Get something out of that empty backstory in addition, right? So, oh, your entire village burned down, or you were betrayed by someone in that. So, like, how are you with people? Do you not trust random people you meet? And the player is like, well, be standoffish, be aggressive towards people, and let that backstory shape current events.
Suffering from seasonal depression?
Right.
Take it out on some goblins.
I cast light.
Yeah, so for a module, do you do backstory with that? Like, what's...
No, that's what I was saying while you dropped out there for a second. So I feel like I've cheated in Saltmarsh because the campaign just started so quickly. It was like, we're going to do this. Let's just do it. And we started playing, and there was I didn't work with anybody one-on-one. I didn't ask anybody backstory. I just said, hey, here's where you're at, here's where you're starting, here's where the module starts. That's where we're starting.
Yeah, right? Go. Now, how do you think that worked out ultimately in hindsight?
I mean, from my perspective, I think it's great. I can do whatever I want from week to week, and like I have a general idea of where I think the longevity is, and you know what we'll get to, and I'm trying to make that entertaining and interesting because I don't have anything to pull at people. So I mean, you know, so it gives and it takes, I guess. But I mean, I certainly enjoy it, and as long as everybody shows up every week, I feel like everybody else is at least having a good enough time.
Now, I think a strong player will take that. I guess it's kind of like the one-shot mentality where you just
you do whatever you want. Yeah,
like, and then they start to drive new storylines, right? Like,
sure. I've got this one character who's after a Pegasus, and it's like crazy. But
I think that would be a really cool mount to have. Don't you?
Yeah, I bet you do.
No, but you're right. Like there have been games, as Jim was alluding to earlier, where maybe I didn't flesh out things as much as I should have beforehand. But I also find myself really rewarded by it because the first time I feel like my character has to talk or do something, I've just made a decision about it. Like, and now I know it. Okay, so this character is going to do this. This is their thing.
Yeah, that's a thing now, right?
Yeah, and or they think that way. Whatever just comes naturally to you as you're playing it can sometimes be a really rewarding way to go about it too.
Yeah, and I think
tougher on a DM, but
for sure. And you know, I came in Dan's current campaign. I came in late, just didn't have a lot of time to get ready, and I showed up with a character with no backstory, basically.
That's true. That's true.
Dan wrote part of my backstory, and I was like, "Yeah, sounds great. I literally have no time right now to do it."
Like I said, this is how your character fits into my world. Then here you go.
Yeah, and in retrospect, like that character's had like quite an arc through kind of like sheer force of will, but sometimes there's like an emptiness to the character where it's like, what does this character really care about? What are the bonds that tie it? What else can you bring up? And it's I think Dan pushed me to develop that a bit more, and now that we're like talking about it here as a DM, it's like, oh, I would have hated getting what I threw up there. It was nothing. It was just
that
nothing.
pile of vomit that I offered.
Yeah, and then in game I was like super aggressive about shaping the story, and it's like I got nothing behind me. You know, like I got nothing to.
Right. Well, it can work both ways. It can work well both ways. Is what I think. You know, a strong player is going to take a no backstory and make personality choices and make it happen. But somebody who's not as strong as in role playing, maybe they struggle more because they want more of a backstory, or they need it to draw upon using the flaws and bonds and all that stuff.
But like, I think in this case, my character will be more fun to play if I go back and add a backstory. You know what? I'm going to do it. I'm going to add a backstory.
Well, let me ask you guys a question. What is, as a DM, how do you approach doing, or do you at all do, NPC background stuff? Like, how deep into that do you get?
I'll have quirks and like types of quirks, and I also have a list of different issues that they have. Like maybe they're dedicated to the church or a deity, or maybe they have a monetary debt of some sort, or whatever. Like I have a list of quirks and something that grounds them. And then, of course, whatever their job is. Okay, so if you're talking to a guard, clearly that informs one piece of the puzzle. And then he sniffles a lot. And then he, you know what I'm saying? Like, and so like if you can just grab a little snippet and bring them in, and this is for sort of sandbox, like I did not expect you to talk to the guard. Okay, you know, but even for big characters, if I didn't expect for you to talk to them or yet, you know, because you go to a new city, and I generally have my cities planned out, I'll still use that same exact thing. Like, okay, so they're into this deity. That's a big thing. They're, you know, and I'll just kind of go with that, and then I'll flesh them out later.
Hey, you said you had your cities planned. What's that like?
I mean, I just have the bare skeleton so that I can then relate them to the characters or the whatever the quest at hand is.
Yeah, I think that it also just depends. A lot of NPCs I have like directional ideas for, but one thing that I think is sometimes overlooked that I try and think about is if there's an NPC in a character's backstory, I try and think, how does that NPC relate in an unexpected way to one of the other characters? Mm-hmm. Right? So if player A has NPC 1 in their backstory, how does NPC 1 relate to a backstory for player C?
That's a great way to tie stuff together.
Yeah, it's just kind of this like...
So I guess the question I would have, like for a new DM who's like, okay, so now you're tying NPCs in the backstory. I mean, do you make like a connection chart for each character? Like, what do you do? I mean, obviously you're thinking about it. Maybe you're not writing it down, but how much do you spend connecting the dots on characters in general? Maybe it's session to session or prior to session 1 or what?
Well, prior to session 1, it depends, I guess, on what I get. So, like we were saying earlier, Jim was saying earlier, you know, you don't want to force it, but if something's there, you know, I'm just waiting to see what I get, and then that'll tell me, you know, how much tying together may be possible here, or is just obvious on the paper, you know, or makes a lot of sense for whatever reason. So I guess the non-answer I'm giving you is that it depends entirely on what I get.
I think for me, I probably spend about 5 minutes, like before a session, to try and make connections. Like not too much time, just is there any new connections that I can make to draw it in? And that's when I jot those notes down. That way it's not so forced, but if there is like heavy lifting, I remember a while back, I was really trying to fit the key in and see what I could hit. And that definitely took a lot longer to generate ideas, as I sort of had it on the back burner and came back to it and then left it and then came back to it. So at one point I did spend some good mental power on it, but in general, in between sessions, it's only maybe 5 minutes.
Okay.
So when we were talking about like going into cities and I like to have like maybe some random encounters that you might meet some of these people, and then in that case, like I will certainly have like a flashed out background and an agenda and all those types of things. If you're talking about like walking in the city and like NPC guard, like I don't really have much for that guy prepared,
Right,
Oh, yeah.
right.
The friend Drew the guard. I don't know.
Well, and it's a great joy as a DM to get to just improv what the hell Drew is.
Sure, of
Like,
course.
that's
Then you
so
just make
funny.
that up. Yeah, then you just make that up, and all of a sudden that's a whole thing.
I think on that comes with confidence. So, like, the more confident you are as a DM, in some ways, the less planning of this that you need to do. So, before every session, I review that Google chart where I have like my big notes, and at the end of the sessions, I tend to jot down notes and write it down. But a lot of the connections I have, like if it's in my mind and I'm thinking about it, I kind of let the session dictate some of that. And sometimes you just make a decision and you're like, oh, this guy's connected to this lady, and you say it and you just own it and confidently.
Right.
And I would say that most of the things where I have players go, what? Or, oh, that was so awesome. I have not planned at all. Right?
Right.
And then I write it down so I remember, like, oh, right, you went in this direction.
Yeah, you're like, my big reveal was not that.
I think that's kind of like, you've got to free associate a little and
For sure.
and let things fall where they will and just kind of put it, but then remember it and follow up on it.
Well, like we said earlier, the players will align themselves sometimes just without you even thinking about it.
Right.
So speaking of aligning themselves, and this is a little bit of a session zero type discussion, but do you try and enforce the kind of the standard four of a wizard, a rogue, a cleric, and a fighter in the party, or do you sort of just let the chips fall where they may?
I'm pretty confident that you can play this edition with any mixture of any sort of party.
I agree, and I've done that, but a lot of people still try and go to hit all four.
Yeah. I don't think about it because similarly, 5e
They want the Golden Girl duo, your quad, right? They want all of them.
I also think that it comes down to what is the point of any of this, and it's to have friends with your fun, have fun with your friends and play a game. That was good.
You'll have friends eventually.
Have friends with your fun, and and part of that, if people get hung up on like, no, you can only do it if you. It's like, do whatever you want. If you're all wizards, I just might come in with heavy melee, and that's fine. And maybe you fireball it down, but maybe you get hit. Like, and again, I think that DMs who overly try and force their rules and rigidity on situations are just missing out on so many opportunities for like wild situations that you didn't plan for.
I actually prefer the imbalance of that. Like, it's great if nobody's stealthy, or if you had all barbarians, or if you had all wizards. Like, I think that's awesome. It creates a real problem for your characters, but it's a great way to overcome obstacles. That makes it complicated and fun.
You create a lot of tension without having one of those key pieces in different instances of, if you don't have a wizard or anybody who has identify or anything like that, you can spend the 8 hours to attune, but the item might be cursed.
Yeah.
There you go.
That stuff's so fun.
You have to take the opportunity. So you should recognize those opportunities and take those opportunities as well as a DM.
Absolutely.
Sorry, Jim. Go ahead.
No, it was just the audio cut off. But I was going to say, like, I just drink the potion because I don't know what it is. We'll see what happens.
Just drink it.
Yeah.
What fool would just drink a magic potion without knowing what it is? Could be poison. Could be poison.
Could be anything. As a character, I like to make sure like I fill one of those pillars. Like when I make a character for a campaign, I always want to fill one of those pillars, and now of course
that's my shtick, right? That like this is my thing, right?
Yeah.
There's a really great video on that I saw recently. Oh wait, I was in it with this.
I think the other, and maybe this is a little off topic, but kind of related to this is as a DM thinking about what you reward. Now, if you only reward combat, then your players are going to start getting in line and only having the standard array of, we're going to have a tank, we're going to have a glass cannon, we're going to have a rogue, we're going to have this. But if you're a DM that, has combat, because combat's fun, no doubt, and sometimes you just need it to fill a session when you're not ready. But if you're if you reward skills and you reward role playing and things like that, which I think of anyone on here, I think John rewards role playing like probably the most, like in a really good way. Like you can role play through something, and John will let you resolve things with role play instead of combat, probably more than most, which I like as a player. I think those sorts of things, your flexibility as a DM, actually give your players flexibility in the characters they choose. As kind of a long answer.
I think that's an interesting point. I know that this is something we didn't talk about in the 3 Pillars video, but I think I only reward characters when they really reach into their backstory. I mean, maybe for a skill or something that was like fun or cool, but I think when I look back at it and really analyze it, I only reward for you role playing your character because of their backstory, because I like them bringing that forward and putting it into the limelight. I think that's the best role playing can be there.
Yeah, because you're cognizant of something that was potentially written a year ago, or a year and a half ago. So you've kept those things in the forefront of your mind, and you're present when you're at the session, and all the, those things are
exactly. That's a great point, because I know I do that a lot. The backstory that I've written for any campaign I'm in, before I jump back into that campaign, I bring it up and I read it again. I'm going through it before every single session so that stuff's front of mind. And I know I'm not making decisions because it's the humorous one in the moment or the most interesting one, but because that's what this character would do. I enjoy that too, because then I feel like I'm really inhabiting it.
And along with this, right, you're teaching your players about your DM style every session. So if they see that someone acted in character, even if it was against their better judgment, but they acted in character, even if you do something as small as you have inspiration, because this was a really stupid thing you did, but it's exactly what your character would do because of their backstory. That, in a way, you're telling the other players it's safe to play your backstory. Like, play your character. Don't just try and meta optimize.
Well, and that's how I reward, typically, using inspiration. Now, I will say I did something very foolish, John, in a one-shot that you did a long time ago, where you remember in Robin Hood where the guy kisses the ring and he pulls the rings off?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, in that case, that was so fun. That was a random thought, and I rolled really well on it. But I was rewarded with a cool ring after, too. Like, you made the stupidest decision, but it worked out, and now you're not just rewarded with, that, but your reward is now a magic ring that you stole off the Baron or whatever.
It was all in the dice, right?
Really?
Like, if that roll doesn't succeed, you are in some shit. That's some hefty role playing. I love that you were taking risks, that drive story. That's great.
But I think you're right. Rewarding them, the players, shows them that you are actively looking for them to engage in their backstory, along with while you're actively in between sessions trying to bring out pieces of their backstory to make it relevant.
Yeah,
for sure.
You said that you like to reward your players with inspiration, but I just wanted to clarify we would all prefer magic items in the future.
So, Jim, if there was a new player that came to you and said, well, what if you had to give one piece of advice on how to incorporate backstory, a player's backstory, and engage with it, what would you tell them?
I think that one piece of advice, I would say just like take this really seriously because it has ramifications. So like, this is actually setting the rest of your campaign. This is setting your experience up for success, so take it really seriously. But that's I guess general. the other piece I would say is embrace flaws. That is, embrace things that you did in your past that maybe your character isn't proud of, or were turning points, or you had flawed relationships, or other people you know had issues, or you made a mistake that you regret. Don't try and be the Boy Scout. I mean, I guess that's one very... You can go that direction and like, my whole life I've had no adversity, and like, you're setting yourself up to have everything taken away from you as a player, right? Which is a fine arc, right? Like, that's actually good arc. But like, embrace flaws and complexity in your backstory and take it seriously.
That's great advice. I agree with that. I think I would say, you know, the more as you're writing the thing, the more that you give your DM to work with, the more involved you're going to be as a player. Because if you're giving your DM great fodder to work from, they're going to use it. And naturally, because you gave it to them, you're going to have to be involved in it. And so, you know, I try and think about that too. Like, what will make, you know, Dan or Jim or John's life easier? You know, what can I give them to work with that will help them? And
John, part of that is probably specifics, right? So just to like on what you're saying, right? It's also like specifics of that fodder. Versus, there was a fire, you know.
Yeah, exactly. That's very well said. Yeah. And Jim, in your most recent campaign, when you asked for backstory, you asked that you gave us a lot of wiggle room there to like. I mean, I think you even then said, say where you're from, and you know, I don't know the world you're building, but you allowed us to invent that, and that's very cool. You know, that got me engaged in creating the character, and then I'm thinking, well, how can I make this something Jim could use?
And that's fun because it sort of offloads a lot of work on him and puts it on us, and then he needs to organize it more.
I stole a city from somewhere else in a campaign and brought it into Jim's.
But see, that's when you do
that's
that.
Now.
It actually is more work for Jim because now he's got all this stuff that may not necessarily obviously fit together. So how do I do it? You know.
I mean, you're going to do legwork on organizing it before or after, right?
Yeah,
so might as well relate it to a character's backstory instead of just like maybe forcing it, right?
Yeah. So for me, one thing we didn't talk about it a lot, but one thing that I love and I'm a big fan of is give me goals, like future goals for your character.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, and I think backstory, to be honest, you know, where's your character going? Like, what do you want to do? Like, give me some things that I can put on the forefront or the horizon for you later on as well, for you to eclipse these peaks that you want to go after. You know, so I think that's huge, and that's something that I always want from my more so than your family. I want to know what you want to do in the future because that's when we're playing the campaign. You know, like, moving forward.
Yeah, like you could say, you know, okay, your family was destroyed, and there's the big bad, you know, goblin guy, right? Who is the leader, but you don't necessarily want to go get him. You just that's how they ended, right? Like so, a goal, asking for the goals is hugely important because that might the fact that your family died, right, or you have amnesia may not be your character's interest.
And you know, one thing to make characters really feel alive, I think, is to have custom printed minis. Like, where would you recommend players get their custom printed minis?
I'm working on my minis. But I have large amounts of maps that they could be from.
Are you? Is Jim your hype guy? I
guess he is.
He's like, I'm going to make sure I get another appearance on this thing.
Yeah, right.
He's giving his DM fodder. See?
I think for me is if you spend a minute in between each session just trying to draw those connections and not forcing the connections, it will eventually come out, even if you are light on connection points or you don't have any backstory. So I'm a huge fan of like making the easy connection, but then just allowing time to make sense of the rest of it, because just as your brain is organized in a certain way to organize ideas and box them into groups, and you will do it no matter what. You can't help but to do it. So let those ideas simmer. I think not trying to, because when you don't, when you try and force an overview, an arc of an adventure, then you start pushing things, and then some DMs will become rigid and say, well, you can't do that because that's not supposed to happen.
Yeah.
Well, it's all relative too. Like, if you're at level 15 and you got to force something in, then you force it in. Like, it is, but don't force it in at level 6 or 5 or 3. Like, let it play out, let it grow, see where it takes you. I think that's the whole takeaway there.
The other part of this is that sometimes, we're talking about where you have something and you want to get it in the story. Sometimes you want more. And I would also encourage DMs, don't be shy about asking for more. And
later on, like, hey, tell me about that, more about that. I need to know. And
I just asked John for more in the campaign that I'm DMing. It was like, hey, tell me more about this specific part. And by the way, if you don't feel like telling me more, I'm going to make it up for you.
I'll make it up for you.
Like, I think you've got an opportunity. Like, tell me more about this area. And I think that the other thing is try and do that not right before you need it. Like, let your player give you that, and let it sit there for a few seconds.
Walk away.
You let it simmer.
Yeah, exactly. Just simmer backstories.
Yeah, let it simmer. It's cooking back there. It's fine.
This channel's changed entirely to a cooking channel now.
All right, well, that is our session on how to engage a player's backstory. Hit the like button, and you'll be able to catch more. Until then, keep rolling.